People think 29 degrees Scorpio is intensity, darkness, obsession, power. But ancient symbols suggest something stranger. What if this degree was never about destruction at all? What if it was about transformation through strategic intervention? One historical source associated with this degree, Safariel, describes an image of a woman in trailing robes holding a wand wrapped in a serpent. Not force, influence, not domination, direction. The serpent isn't chaos, it's intelligence, adaptation, the ability to move through systems without announcing yourself. That image changes everything. Because suddenly, this degree stops looking like destruction and starts looking like someone who understands how to move systems without standing in the center of them. People often misunderstand Scorpio energy. They imagine destruction. But 29 degrees Scorpio doesn't destroy for the sake of destruction. It filters. It sees what's broken. It removes what no longer serves. And then it builds something stronger in its place. Maybe 29 degrees Scorpio was never about power over people. Maybe it was always about transformation through strategic intervention. If the historical symbols stopped there, this would stay mythology. But this is where 29 degrees Scorpio becomes interesting. Because in the modern world, most people with this energy aren't carrying spears. They're carrying information. They're carrying strategy. They're carrying systems. This degree doesn't always appear as power in the obvious sense. Sometimes it appears as invisible architecture, the person who redesigns the experience everyone uses, the strategist who changes public opinion with one sentence, the creator whose work reaches people because it says something nobody else was willing to articulate, the security analyst who notices patterns before damage appears, the researcher who pulls one thread and reveals the entire structure underneath. That's why I don't read this degree as intensity. I read it as filtration, the ability to remove noise and identify signal, to understand what matters, to recognize where energy is leaking, to see where systems fail. And that changes how this degree behaves in everyday life. People with this placement may notice that others tell them things quickly, not because they ask, but because they create the feeling of being understood. They notice inconsistencies. They remember details. They often become the person everyone consults before making difficult decisions. At work, they may naturally move toward roles where influence matters more than visibility. Narrative, strategy, research, protection, design, investigation, and in relationships, this degree can become complicated. Because depth becomes normal, surface conversations become exhausting. People performing versions of themselves become obvious. Trust becomes sacred. And because trust is sacred, betrayal can feel larger than the event itself. Not because of possession, but because once someone is allowed into the inner world, they matter. This degree can also become misunderstood, because observation can look like judgment. Privacy can look like secrecy. Precision can look like control. But underneath all of it, there is usually the same question: how do I protect what matters, without becoming responsible for everything? And that question begins leading us toward the shadow and the gift of this degree. Every degree has a tension. Every gift creates a responsibility. And for 29 degrees Scorpio, the shadow doesn't begin with intensity. It begins with control. Because when you become good at seeing beneath the surface, you start noticing patterns everywhere. You anticipate outcomes. You see people's motivations. You recognize weaknesses before anyone says them out loud. And slowly, a dangerous belief can begin to form. If I don't manage this, everything will collapse. So, influence becomes intervention. Intervention becomes responsibility. Responsibility becomes exhaustion. And eventually, protection becomes isolation. That's the shadow. Not manipulation in the cartoon sense. Not villainy. Something quieter. The belief that your value comes from carrying what other people cannot. That your role is to absorb pressure, to organize chaos, to hold the emotional or strategic burden because nobody else sees what you see. But over time, that becomes lonely. Because the person who sees everything can begin feeling like nobody sees them. And that's where the lesson changes. Because the mature expression of this degree isn't control, it's trust. Trust that truth does not need force. Trust that systems do not always need saving. Trust that people sometimes have to live their own lessons. The gift of 29 degrees Scorpio isn't domination. It's discernment. It's knowing what deserves your energy and what doesn't. It's seeing broken systems and choosing to build instead of destroy. It's understanding power dynamics without becoming consumed by them. It's making people feel seen instead of exposed. It's creating structures that continue serving people long after you've stepped away. And maybe that's why so many of the historical symbols point in the same direction. Not toward conquest, not toward attention, but toward stewardship, toward someone standing near the edge of the room, seeing more than most, and choosing carefully where to intervene. Because maybe 29 degrees Scorpio was never asking you to become powerful. Maybe it was asking you to become responsible. And responsibility is heavier than most people realize.